Greetings, class. Greetings, students. We are nearing the end of the semester, and Unit 5 is coming up for you guys in either a week or 2 weeks, depending on which section you're in. And Unit 5 is going to cover that last pinch of the peripheral nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, digestive, urinary, and reproductive system. And I want to today make a video about the urinary system. I want to use these models that I'm going to use during the lab exam to talk about these different structures and point them out on these models and say a couple of important things about them. And I'm going to point the camera at this dry erase board, and I'm going to recreate the activity that we just did with Thursday group, where I draw a diagram or a schematic, kind of a crude drawing of a nephron, but one that shows all the named parts in order that I want you guys to be able to do yourselves. We'll talk also about the blood supply to the kidney. The blood supply to the kidney is, a little complicated. It's got a lot of named branches, and the arrangement of it is important. And the destination of that arterial blood is in particular very important, especially in the renal corpuscle, where the arterioles of the glomerulus are surrounded by and invested by the cells of Bowman's capsule. That's the site of filtration of the blood in the kidneys. That's what you could call the business end of the kidneys, or where the magic happens. And that in particular is really an important thing to understand. Once you understand that delicate anatomy there, you can appreciate how years of long-standing uncontrolled high blood pressure could damage those fragile structures. And you can see as well that even though they are fragile in some ways and appear so, they're also resilient and amazing, and can perform decades of filtering toxins and poisons and all sorts of materials to protect us and keep us alive. So really a pretty cool organ. So on this model, the gross anatomy of the kidney that's important here is going to be first to direct our attention to this region known as the hilum. The hilum is like a gateway to an organ. The liver and the spleen and the lungs all have a hilum, and the kidney has a hilum. It's the area where the major structures come and go, out of the kidney. The hilum of the kidney contains a renal artery, shown here in red, a renal vein, shown in blue, and this beige-colored ureter. The renal artery is a branch off the aorta, straight off the aorta, and carries oxygenated blood into the kidney and ultimately into the renal corpuscle, where it's filtered. Some of that blood is pushed out of those glomerular arterioles and enters the nephron, and some stays in the blood vessel and leaves the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole and enters the peritubular capillaries, which ultimately form the larger and larger and larger veins that dump into this renal vein, which empties into the inferior vena cava. At the other end of the nephron, from the renal corpuscle, the distal end of the nephron, where that hollow tube transporting urine empties into the collecting ducts, which empty into the minor and major calyces, and ultimately the renal pelvis, which narrows down into a ureter, one from each kidney, one on each side. The ureters continue down in the retroperitoneum to dump into the urinary bladder. This muscular sac, which is a storage facility for urine, when the time is right, the detrusor muscle, which makes up the wall of the bladder, can contract, and the urinary sphincters, both internal and external, can relax, and urine can be excreted out the body through the urethra out and into the outside world. On this model of the kidney, grossly, and even on our dissection today, you can appreciate the difference between this outer cortex and the inner medulla. Remember, the inner medulla is arranged in pyramid shapes. And when it's cut in a cross-section like this, it looks like a seashell or a triangle. But this model is nice because it shows you that there's a three-dimensional structure to the renal pyramids, the medulla. Okay? In the cortex is where the glomeruli are found. It's where Bowman's capsule is. And those renal corpuscles are either very nearby the medulla, or perhaps closer to the periphery. There's a couple of different arrangements of nephrons, and the difference right now for us is not important, but the loops, the nephron loops, dip down into the medulla, into the pyramids. Then ultimately the collecting ducts kind of converge on the tips or the apex or the points of these pyramids, where they're able to dump into the minor calyces. There are portions of cortex that extend between the renal pyramids. They're called renal columns, the roots of cortex. There's a tough capsule that surrounds the kidney. There's fat and connective tissue that surrounds and supports the kidney, perirenal fascia, adipose tissue and connective tissue that supports and suspends it in the retroperitoneum. And that, along with low paraspinal muscles and posterior back muscles and the ribs, all provide support and protection of the kidney. If we set this aside and start to take a closer and closer look at these structures, first we're going to see a look like this one, which is a little bit more magnified than the other. And I really want to draw your attention to these red balls. These red balls represent renal corpuscles or glomeruli. Okay. These red balls or glomeruli are tangles or globs or network of arterioles. This is not a capillary bed that has some arteries blending into veins. This is like a rest stop off a highway, going still all in the same direction, still part of that same whatever northbound highway. But it's kind of a scenic detour where blood can pass through these glomerular arterioles. Some of that blood is going to be pushed out and filtered out of the bloodstream, collected by Bowman's capsule, shunted and flowing into the nephron. Some of that blood is going to continue on out of the glomerulus, out the efferent arteriole, and into the peritubular capillaries, which ultimately become veins, ultimately drain into the renal vein and dump into the IVC. I don't want you to think of glomerulus as a capillary bed. It is not a capillary bed. But it shows you on here that these interlobular arteries become afferent arterioles, which lead to these glomeruli. And if we zoom in a little bit on this magnification of the model, you see here some of these red balls that represent these glomeruli. And then even here, these red balls represent Bowman's capsule surrounding a glomerulus. And Bowman's capsule leads into the first part of this winding nephron tubules that ultimately leads into collecting ducts, which together empty into minor, then major calyces, renal pelvis, ureter, bladder, urethra, toilet. This light green portion that immediately follows Bowman's capsule is called a proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted means winding or twisting or twisted, and the proximal convoluted tubule is the beginning of the proximal part of the nephron. Whenever you've got a tube where stuff flows in one direction, you can name a proximal part of that tube and a distal part of that tube, and this is the proximal part of it. And urine is flowing in this direction through the proximal convoluted tubule into the nephron loop. The nephron loop, which used to be called the loop of Henle, and until today it was called the loop of Henle by me, I'm not calling it the loop of Henle anymore, because I want to use anatomic terms that are descriptive and useful and not named after some Dr. Henle or whoever has gotten all the credit he needs. We're going to call it the nephron loop now. You can call it whatever you want, and I know. But for me, I'm calling it the nephron loop, and the nephron loop has a descending limb in light green and an ascending limb now in brown or orange. This ascending limb leads into this distal convoluted tubule, which dumps into the collecting ducts. So that's the parts of the nephron in order. This is a really magnified view of of one of these renal corpuscles. And remember, a renal corpuscle is a glomerulus plus a Bowman's capsule. And we see an afferent arteriole bringing blood into this network. And then there's an efferent arteriole that leaves. This half of the diagram, or the model, shows the afferent arterioles just as they are the blood vessels. I might have to leave. I might have to go to a different room, sorry.